So it seems that people are making warriors work on the tabletop once more. Canoptek reanimated a winning tournament in the Awakened Dynasty, and the Silent King is doing work in and out of Obeisance Phalanx. Let's take a look at a whole bunch of tournament winning Necron lists and what's doing well for them right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons, and for this video I thought we'd do a roundup of 6 of the strongest Necron tournament lists since the last balance update, with a whole bunch of interesting points changes for Necrons. I was certainly seeing what good players were choosing to put on the table for the list that they were trying to win grand tournaments with. At time of recording, it hasn't been so long since the last balance update, that broadly speaking Necrons seem to be doing rather well right out of the gate, around about 51-52% win percentages overall in big tournaments, and they appear to be the single most successful faction in terms of actual event wins so far. 4 5-round tournament wins, all in the first weekend, 2 with Hypercrypt Legion and 2 with Awakened Dynasty, and so far that's the most out of any faction so far. So definitely a good bit of early success there. It still seems that after the points changes, the Hypercrypt Legion is the single most popular detachment. I feel like after the points updates though, perhaps the gap has narrowed a little bit. Quite a lot of the things that were being run excessively in Hypercrypts did get some points rises, things like very small cheap units for interference deep strike, plus the Monolith going up a bit, where a few other competitors that weren't running that so much dropped down in cost a touch. Beyond that, Awakened Dynasty seems to be very solid in second place, with the big buffs for squads led by leaders, plus some rather powerful stratagems. The Canoptek Court still has a few people using it, but generally doesn't seem to have been seeing any big tournament success in really quite a long time. And it's cool to see that a few people are having a go with the Obeisance Phalanx. It did seem like one of the on-paper winners, with things like Triarch Praetorians dropping down, plus the Silent King getting the relevant keyword. Only a few people have been trying it, though it seems that they've been doing at least okay with it. In any case, let's talk through a whole bunch of those winning tournaments, the 4 event winners and 2 more, and focus on just a couple of units from each for what people are using to win. First up, for the single biggest Necron event win, was this Hypercrypt Legion list by Andy Quaz-Cohen, who used it to take first at the Coventry GT 2-day event, going 5 games to 0 at a big 84-player tournament. Hypercrypt Legion has been the strongest detachment for quite some time now. Necrons that can warp off the board, redeploy where needed, including the potential for very scary 3-inch deep strikes, so you can have some massive threats turning up right next to the enemy and laying things low. This list is really dominated by a few big models that I guess could make pretty good use of those redeploys. Kind of massive to have enormous threats like that, just deep strike at 9 inches or even 3-inch drop if needed. There's Zarek the Silent King himself, just quite all-round efficient with some scary shooting with those big annihilation beams, and some nice rerolls that could buff the Doomsday Arks. There's a Tesseract Vault despite the points increase, another big tough problem unit that's going to need serious amounts of firepower to take it down, some all very scary Catan powers, plus anti-infantry with those Tesla spheres, and there's a Canoptek Spider to make big units like the Silent King and Tesseract Vault extra hard to kill with a feel no pain. Then there's 2 Doomsday Arks with really quite efficient long-range anti-tank that could benefit from the Silent King's rerolls, and are quite nice in Hypercrypt as they could just warp off the board and set up for a perfect firing lane if you need it. They felt like one of the strangest points changes in the last balance update. 190 points for one of those is seriously good. There's also the massive great big stack of stats that is the Nightbringer, just shy of 300 points but enormous damage and enormous defense. With 3 enormous units and 2 relatively sturdy Doomsday Arks, enemy damage output is going to be seriously stretched. He could potentially use the Hypercrypt Legion rules to get closer for a 9-inch charge maybe. They would need to arrive on the flanks, and he perfectly could just move up to a mid-board objective and dare the enemy to get close to him. Then beyond that, there's a whole bunch of small units for doing secondary objectives and board control style things. These should be great to harvest up the tactical objectives that Hypercrypt can do really easily. 3 Hexmark destroyers as Necron lone operatives that can do a little bit of volume fire against lighter infantry. 1 squad of 5 death marks. 1 unit of flayed ones that can screen out the mid-board with their infiltration, and then 2 units of single locust destroyers. Nice cheap 35-point units that can also redeploy if needed. Overall looks like a seriously spooky list to go against. Enormous big damage threats that you can't guarantee are going to stay in any one place, and then a whole bunch of nuisance units that are individually going to be irritating to hunt down for their points cost and can score objectives really easily with the redeploys. Focusing on a couple of the units, the Silent King certainly seems like he's really strong for the Necrons, though not so much so that he's in every list. He is really quite a big chunk of points, and if you commit to him then you'll be passing up other options. For the points cost though, he is definitely very intimidating. 26 wounds with 4+ invulnerable saves, and those Menhirs that could absorb a bit of overkill potentially. Some serious shooting that you can't really ignore too much with those Annihilator beams at strength 14, damage 6, plus some other stuff. Lots of attacks in melee, and some nice buffs for both his and Doomsday Ark style shooting. Rerolling hit rolls and wound rolls of 1 is rather nasty. He can be a great target for any stratagems that can affect him, including crazy things like that 3-inch deep strike one should it make sense to late game. And he also gained the Triarch keyword recently as well, which is pretty relevant for the Obeisance Phalanx, meaning that he can work with those options and make that detachment significantly stronger. While we're talking Hypercrypt things as well, it's maybe worth focusing on the Hexmark Destroyer. 70 points for a lone operative is just pretty excellent with those redeploys. Inbuilt deep strike means he can land where he needs to, and lone operative might keep him safer than squads of death marks potentially. He gets 6 fairly nasty, ignores cover shots with the pistols, only really that great for killing 1 wound infantry though. Free Overwatch for 0 CP that hits on a 2+, so could potentially double down on things if they move around in front of him. And potential return fire, which could be kind of disruptive if the opponent shoots but doesn't quite kill him. Overall quite a solid utility unit that can be cheap enough just to be completely expendable, but every so often might ruin a squad of objective scorers if he's given the chance to. As a quick aside, if you do happen to be picking up any Necron or other 40k goodness in the near future, one way that you can support the channel is buying through the affiliate discount retailers linked in the video description, which also save a good amount versus Games Workshop's Warhammer web store. There's Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21%, Venomous Workshop for 10% off, Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%, and Tash and Geldeep in the EU and Germany for 16%. Plenty of other good discount retailers exist of course, but a big thank you to anyone using those down below. It does help to support the channel and keep the videos coming. Moving on with the Necron list though, next up we have a really quite different Hypercrypt Legion list, this one run by Colin Watts, who used it to take first at a smaller grand tournament called Dice Like Ice GT, going 5 wins to no losses at a 33 player event. Definitely interesting to see the differences with this one. This one goes all in with not 1 but 2 monoliths on the board. Seems that the boosted 400 point price tag certainly wasn't enough to make them an inefficient choice. They're big and tanky and come with some hard-hitting death rays. To back them up again, there's 2 Doomsday Arks, so quite a frightening amount of anti-tank on the board between the 2 there. And once again there's a Canoptek Spider to offer some Feel No Pain and Fabricated Claw type goodness. Then the rest of the list goes down really quite a different tack. Rather than lots of small units for objective scoring purposes, instead there's 2 big blocks of Necron warriors armed with Gauss Flayers. It looks like one's joined by a Chronomancer with Dimensional Overseer. That allows an additional unit to Hyperphase, and one with a Plasmancer with Arisen Tyrant, the one that gives you some big rerolls once the squad drops on the board. I guess the warriors will be putting out a really serious amount of objective control and be a hard unit to outright wipe out, particularly if they're maybe deployed with some of them within a terrain piece and some without. Following some command points, there's Imitate the Stormlord as well. He rustles up a command point per turn and I guess could make one of those Necron warrior blocks into a far riskier prospect to charge as he adds a little bit of quality melee. And then there's just 1 unit of Death Marks, which I guess could drop for secondaries. Between those big blocks and 2 monoliths and Imitate for the extra command points, it looks like the list is really trying to set up to use those big 2 command points, big movement trick style stratagems. There's the one for 2 command points that can allow a Necron infantry unit to just fade away after it was attacked and then deploy right next to a monolith and hopefully safe. Or potentially that Dimensional Corridor one, which could allow you to charge out of a monolith potentially, maybe swamping an objective that you otherwise might not have been able to get to. I'm sure there'll be some great use of the 3-inch deep strike stratagem as well, and just a whole load of very scary anti-tank firepower just repeatedly warping around the boards to blast stuff. It does feel like you might need to be kind of careful about what winds up in close combat with the army though, as it looks like it could really limit your options with this. The monoliths don't have no threat in combat, but it does leave them a lot less to do. In any case, pretty cool to see Necron warriors doing well on the board. For unit focuses, the monolith's 400 points now. That was up 25 points compared with its previous version. A great big toughness 13 2+ save space pyramid. An anti-infantry style particle whip with some devastating wounds, but perhaps the scariest threat coming from 4 death rays, 4 shots at strength 12, AP 4 and damage D6+1 with sustained hits D3 if you roll some big 6s. It's not useless in melee as well with the Portal of Exile, and its rules work really well with Hypercrypt. You can have units that go off the board, emerge from its Eternity Gate if it makes sense to get super close, and you can potentially do that after the monolith itself has warped around the board too. Plus there's other nice stratagems to support it, such as the 4+ invulnerable save one. The Doomsday Ark certainly feels like it deserves another focus shout out as well. These were already played plenty in competitive play, so it's a bit weird that they dropped down from 200 points to 190. In general, they're just very strong vehicles. The big Doomsday Cannon with D6+1 shots at strength 18, AP 4 and damage 4 is serious anti-tank and okay against elite infantry as well. It can get heavy and devastating wounds if static, and as mentioned for the list before, it gets a lot from Zarek the Silent King's rerolls. It's also pretty tough with 14 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save, quite nice against serious enemy anti-tank there. and certainly it isn't useless against infantry that might try and get too close to its deployment zone, with a whole bunch of Gauss flares striking out with 20 shots with lethal hits at close range. It seems that 2 of them seem to be considered a sweet spot for a lot of these lists, though it looks like you could run more if you wanted. Next up, we've got an Awakened Dynasty list, this one by Mark Morrow, who used it to win GaleCon, another mid-sized 30-odd player grand tournament going 5 wins undefeated. Awakened Dynasty is the other popular competitive Necron detachment and the reinterpreted Index detachment. There's a big focus on characters leading their squads around, giving them +1 to hit innately. They've got several very strong enhancements, and plenty of the stratagems are rather nice. There's a reroll hit stratagem, advance and shoot, a nice reactive reanimation where you get D3+1 wounds back, and that could trigger other rules such as Canoptek reanimators, and it gets back up style 1 for slain characters too. In this list there's really quite a lot going on and an absolute stack of characters. There's 4 big threats with attached leaders. Looks like an Overlord with a Void Scythe goes with 10 Lychguard, a big chunky durable unit that could use the Hungry Void quite well, and the reactive reanimation type stratagem. They've also got a Resurrection Orb as well, and he could easily restore a whole bunch of the squad there. There's a Skorpekh Lord with 3 Destroyers, which are a pretty punchy anti-elite melee threat, and the Skorpekh Lord picks up a 4+ feel no pain, so he's basically twice as tanky as he is normally, and his defensive profile was already quite good. It looks like there's an Immortal squad with Tesla Carbines led by a Chronomancer with the Veil of Darkness. That could give you a unit that can clear enemies off objectives really well, potentially with 4 rerolls to hit if they need it, and their own special rule gives them rerolls to wound. They'll be able to shoot the enemy, get a bit more toughness from the Chronomancer, and then also with his move shoot move ability they could also move into interesting areas of the board to do objectives and things. Certainly a very threatening unit with huge options. There's then a Technomancer with the Netherrealm Casket. He's leading a unit of 6 Wraiths with Claws and Particle Casters, so that's a spectacularly tanky squad there. Loads of wounds that are very hard to take off between Stealth, the 5+ Feel No Pain, and the Wraith's own stat lines. Again, that looks like it to be a great target for reactive reanimation or that Canoptek reanimator to be nearby. Then finally there's 2 Psychomancers. Looks like they'd just be running solo as annoying objective disruption things. They can genuinely be a big irritation to enemy scoring. If they can hide out of line of sight within 6 inches of an objective, then potentially they can make enemies fail Battle Shock, and also throw more tests around with Harbingers of Despair. And I guess in Awakened Dynasty, they're a little bit more resilient to just being one shot by something annoying, given that they can use that 1 command point stratagem to stand back up. Finally, and I guess buffing the battle line, there's Illuminor Szeras. He could help those Immortals with AP buffs and debuffs, as also just a pretty scary lone operative style character if he's near infantry. And again, could be an okay choice for standing back up on death to make sure that he can't be one shot. Then beyond all the big threats, there's a screening unit of 3 Scarabs, an infiltrating unit of 5 Flayed Ones, a set of 2 Crypto Thralls, interestingly enough, that I really haven't seen in many lists whatsoever. Looks like they're adding a little bit more chunk to the Immortals, I suppose. 2 individual Nuisance Locust Destroyers, and then a couple of Doomsday Arks to back up the whole thing with some serious firepower. Overall, a pretty massive amount going on there. 4 very scary threats, some of them that are really quite hard to take off the table and can reanimate very well. A bunch of objective grabbers, and a couple of really big guns sat at the back to blast away enemy tanks and vehicles. The Psychomancers also look like they could be very disruptive with stopping people scoring. For some cool units out of this one, Illuminor Szeras is 175 points. He gets lone operative when he's within 3 inches of any other friendly Necron units, and just has a fairly intimidating stat line all around. A bunch of strength 9, damage 3, both at range and in melee. 9 wounds at toughness 8 with a massive 4+ feel no pain ability, which is kind of crazy. A lot of units will fail to one-shot him, and he can reanimate some very valuable wounds, particularly if anything can boost it. And then he has his augmentation ability to debuff AP for things like Immortals and amp up the Tesla with a little bit of AP. Between all that, there's really quite a lot of good value. Lychguard also seems to be a much more intimidating unit in Awakened Dynasty, perhaps versus Hypercrypt, even if they can theoretically use the movement tricks rather well. They're pretty cheap models at 17 points each, and they're fairly durable with toughness 5, 2 wounds, and a 4+ invulnerable save, plus -1 to wound against attacks that are greater than their toughness. They'll get good value out of things like Necron Lord Resurrection Orbs and reactive reanimation things. The damage output is maybe a little bit lacking against anything that they can't wound on a 4+ or better, but they should be able to grind away at things in melee over a couple of turns if needed. For another take on the Awakened Dynasty, this was the last of the 4 winning Necron lists of the first weekend, this one by Jason Flanzer, using it to win Battle Against Breast Cancer. A 28-player grand tournament. This one's seriously quite interesting, using a bunch of Skorpekh Destroyers and Necron Warriors to take victory. There's 3 sets of 3 Skorpekh Destroyers, all led by Skorpekh Lords, one with the Dermal Bond stratagem once more. and I guess they can make good use of the protocol of the Hungry Void against certain targets. Otherwise, there's 2 big squads of 20 Necron warriors that are armed with Gauss Reapers for a little bit of extra AP this time, and it looks like each of them have a Royal Warden for the fall back and shoot plus a few extra shots. One of them taking the Veil of Darkness and one taking the Netherrealm Casket, the one for stealth things. One of them has a Plasmancer, which I guess will be the Veil of Darkness unit. You could drop in and then have a whole bunch of lethal hits on 5s and then re-roll all the hits for 1 command point. And the other one likely led by Orican the Diviner. He gives the unit a 4+ invulnerable save, plus has a once per game big damage threat, so they seem like they'd be a great unit to stomp up the midboard and hold 1 objective against all comers. -1 to hit and a 4+ invulnerable save seem like a really nice combo, and it could be a good choice for reactive reanimation with the Warrior's special rule. I'd guess that Canoptech Reanimator is going to be keeping close to give them an extra boost on the reanimation there. Interestingly, just to triple down on the big reanimation threat that the Warriors can do, there's also a Ghost Ark here too. Both the Necron Warrior squads are too big to embark in it, so I guess there'd be another infantry character starting in it. I guess maybe it's one of the Hexmarks unless it's Illuminor Szeras. It's somewhat tough and brings a bunch more lethal hits to the table, but I guess its main job here is that it can trigger yet another reanimation. So another 4 or 5 of those Necron Warriors restored to the board once the enemies finish making attacks. It just feels like that's a unit that you could dump loads of firepower into, and then they could basically ping back to near enough full health. Otherwise, we've got Illuminor Szeras once more. Again, his AP debuffs and buffs could be helpful for both warrior squads. There's 2 Hexmark destroyers that I guess will be good for dropping for secondaries, 2 flayed ones for screening out the midboard, 1 unit of Ophidian destroyers for return to reserves and then drop down to do secondaries, a single Locust destroyer which could be a nice enough backfill screening squad, and 3 Scarab Swarms for a bit of disruption, and they can have a bit of OC as well if they get near to one of the Cryptex. Overall, interesting to see someone making a really reanimation-focused Necron Warrior list win an event once more. Pretty fun to see that as a viable tactic again, even if it must be kind of horrendous trying to deal with that Warrior squad with its many layers of defense. The Skorpekh destroyers led by the Skorpekh Lords look like they're pretty fun, and massively dangerous melee threats lurking around as well, maybe bursting out of cover and chopping things to bits. In any case, judging by a couple of the lists here, it certainly seems that Necron Warriors can work at Grand Tournament level if you want them to, even if they'd kind of been much maligned for a while at 100 points per 10 of them. It seems that after the points changes and just being a really big durable unit that can be the focus of individual character leaders and stratagems and things, there's at least a fair bit of draw to play in them both in Awakened Dynasty and Hypercrypt. I still feel like unsupported, their individual stat lines really are quite underwhelming. Only hitting on a 4 with their lethal hit small arms and not being all that tough at a single wound with a 4+ save. And their reanimation buff just isn't really all that much to write home against, even if it will add up if you're rolling lots and lots of reanimation dice, as seems to be the case with Awakened Dynasty and Canoptech Reanimators about. Otherwise, fun to see a few armies taking Skorpekh destroyers as well. It does seem that they're a legitimate threat in Awakened. I guess hitting on 2s re-rolling certainly doesn't hurt. The Hungry Void can mean that they're Strength 8 and AP 3 attacks rather than Strength 7 and Damage 2, which would rate as really quite a big jump. And the Skorpekh Lord can certainly chip in with his lethal hits and his own big hitting melee, and potentially using Dermal Bond. Next up, as mentioned, at least a few people have been using Obeisance Phalanx since the update. It still seems to be very much in the minority versus Awakened and Hypercrypt, that one person managed to get a 3rd place event here. A Vasily Golik who used it to take 3rd at Goose Hunting Donuts. That appears to be a 40-player grand tournament where they went 4-1. Obeisance Phalanx is where you get a sort of Necron Oath of Moment where you mark 1 unit and get +1 to the wound roll for Nobles, Lychguard or Triarch units. There's a few fun supporting things, a warlord trait called Eternal Conqueror, which allows you to reroll hits against enemies on objectives, a 1 CP for critical hits on a 5+, a -1 damage stratagem for vehicles, which is nice enough, given that Necron ones often have good saves and a bunch of wounds, and a chance to fight on death for 1 command point. With the Silent King gaining the Triarch keyword, I guess he's the motivation for trying this out once more. +1 to wound is definitely nice enough, both on his range and melee, and can add some big rerolls to anything else nearby as well. Then this list takes a trio of Overlords, each of them taking the Blade and Tachyon Arrow for a little bit of focal anti-tank. One takes Eternal Conqueror for the rerolls one, and one has Honourable Combatant for getting some more command points if he happens to slay characters. It looks like they're leading 2 squads of 10 Lychguard with a sword and shield. A very sturdy battle line there that has certainly enjoyed the +1 to wound and a few of the other stratagems, and it seems that one of them's paired with Orican the Diviner in an Immortal squad. That's taking Gauss and potentially if you had that with the reroll hits one, you could have them both rerolling hits, potentially getting lethal hits on a 5+, and then also rerolling wound rolls as well, and Orican the Diviner making them far tougher in return with a 4+ invulnerable save. There's then a big squad of Triarch Praetorians with the Rods of Covenant. Potentially could be a fairly nasty rapid ingress deep strike threat, I guess. Again, all the stratagems and the damage boosts work on them, and a +1 to wound would go down very well with their strength 5 and damage 2 attacks. There's a Doomsday Ark that could body up with the Silent King for some big rerolls, and then not 1 but 3 Triarch Stalkers, pretty cheap scouting walkers that don't really have a whole bunch of threat. They can potentially remove cover though, which could be a big deal for that Gauss Immortal squad. They're at least fairly sturdy for the points with 12 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save and only 110 each. And they can chip in with some slightly general purpose shooting damage. A couple of them take heavy Gauss cannons and one takes a heat ray. With their Triarch keyword, it looks like they'd probably work best here more so than anything else. And they can just scout into the midfield and make a nuisance of themselves. They feel like they'd be quite expendable in this. In any case, pretty cool to see Obeisance Phalanx actually doing kind of well on the tabletop. Here's the datasheet for the Triarch Praetorians. They're a unit that got a massive points cut in the last update, though they were very overcosted before. They dropped from 120 points down to 100 points per 5 of them. Jump pack Necron units, striking with the Rods of the Covenant in this list at least, for strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2 shooting attacks at range and in melee. I feel like they're a unit that still needs to pick their targets. Even if they had the +1 to wound against things, there's going to be some things that they just don't really do all that much against, but could definitely make a nasty mess of certain enemy elite infantry. Finally, we've got one hilariously grim looking list that proves that Catan spam is very much alive and well if you want it to be. This Hypercrypt Legion list by Devin Swan was used to take second at the Toronto Falls Open, going 5 wins to 1 loss at a 60-player event. This Settlers of Catan list has no less than 6 of the monstrous star gods, the Nightbringer, Deceiver, Void Dragon, 3 Transcendent Catan, and then just absolutely minimal objective scoring units beyond that, 2 Hexmark Destroyers, 1 singular Skorpekh Lord, and then 1 unit of 5 Immortals with Tesla Carbines. The Catan themselves would just be absolutely monstrous to try and deal with. Even taking down one of them is really quite a big effort for an army. Halving damage, a massive feel no pain, a good invulnerable save, and high toughness with plenty of wounds, and then if you just fall short they'll start reanimating. The Void Dragon and the Nightbringer also have kind of standout damage as well. The Deceiver and the Transcendent ones are a lot better against sort of medium infantry type targets as opposed to big really tough threats. Though given that they're likely to survive for a few activations, they're probably still fine on that front as well. In Hypercrypts, you could be deep striking the Transcendent Catan around multiple times and still threatening to have 9-inch charges. The others could maybe warp up to within 9 inches of a board edge to threaten bits on the flanks too. Either that or move up onto the mid-board objectives and dare the enemy to try and take them down. They don't have crazy amounts of objective control, and against a good player using terrain well, the list might not be quite as easy to play and win with as it might look on paper. It's perhaps the sort of thing that tends to absolutely dominate in casual games, but you don't actually see it at the very top of grand tournaments like this quite as often as you might think. It still looks incredibly intimidating to play against though, just having so many threats on the board that you know you basically don't have much chance of removing, and having to make tough choices about when to sacrifice units to grab points with their objective control, when to go all in on damage, and trying to stop the other units from warping around the board running off with more secondary points as well. It certainly wouldn't be an easy game. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Broadly speaking, I feel like it's kind of positive for the Necrons out of this list review. It's not like just one thing that's being spammed is winning all the armies. Plenty of different variety here. Some people using super heavies, firepower units and interference things and going light on the core units. Some armies going very heavy into infantry led by characters, and Awakened Dynasty still seems to be absolutely fine on the tabletop. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, including any other insights as to how these might have been played. As mentioned earlier on as well, if you want to support the channel with any Warhammer purchases, there's a bunch of affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description. If you did happen to be picking up some Necrons or other 40k things in the near future, can save a little bit of money versus Games Workshop at least. In any case, a big thank you for listening. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'm sure we'll have more for the Necrons in the future at some point. And then finally, if you'd like to help support the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description too. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.